Well, good news, the vertical stabilizer, as you can see, is completely done. Finished up all the riveting on that. Everything's been painted, primed, put together. So if you want to see how that whole process worked and how we ended up here, stay tuned. Here we go. If you're new to the channel, this is the third video in a series following the build of a Vans RV-14 aircraft. This episode follows me as I complete the construction of the vertical stabilizer. For those unfamiliar, the vertical stabilizer is the vertical fin on the tail of the airplane, and as the name suggests, it provides stability relative to the vertical axis as the aircraft moves forward through the air. The first two videos covered the forming of the internal skeletal structure of the stabilizer, as well as the initial fitting of the skin. And now, we pick up where we left off at the end of the last video. So everything in the tail section has been dimpled, the skin's been dimpled. Now everything gets primed, and then once that's done, I'll put some countersinks on the back of this, which is the rear spar, and that'll match the dimples that we just put with the 1/8 inch dimpled eyes in the bottom section of the rear spar. And then we'll assemble. The first step in the priming process is preparing the surface of the aluminum to accept the primer. For this, I'm using a solution known as pre-coat. It's a one-step solution which my research has indicated to be highly recommended. It's widely used in the aviation industry and by the military. The information and instructions on their website indicate that it replaces multiple steps typically required of other methods, including iodine baths and the like. It's also non-toxic and environmentally friendly, which make using it easier as it has no toxic soups to dispose of later. I'm following the instructions from the manufacturer here, which are very simple. Spray the pre-coat solution on the part and scuff with a maroon Scotch-Brite. Then spray another application of the pre-coat and scuff perpendicular to the last pass to ensure good coverage. Now simply rinse the part with water and dry with a microfiber cloth. That's it. It's now ready for primer. I've seen some people do a final wipe with alcohol or acetone, but the manufacturer specifically says not to wipe or apply any other solutions prior to priming. So now I'm just assembling my little makeshift paint booth that I came up with. It's just a bunch of PVC pipes that I'll put together to form a nice little frame and then cover that in some plastic. In the front, to vent the fumes out, I've got a couple of fans stacked together in place to pull the air through. Behind that, all sealed up with some tape around the edges, I've got a standard air filter, and it overall seems to work out pretty well. The air filter gets pretty caked up with paint by the end of the entire process, so I just dispose of that at the end. But no paint's coming through to the fan blades or anything, and it seems to be pulling all the air out of my little booth, so it seems to work really well. During the painting process, I am wearing a full suit and a respirator, because these fumes are pretty toxic. It's spelled out pretty clearly on the manufacturer label, and just taking the top off the can of paint, you can tell this is some really strong stuff. For the primer, there's a lot of different choices out there, and I did a lot of research and reading up on it, and in the end I just decided to go with the same primer that Vans uses on their quick build kits. I won't get into all the reasons, but at the end of the day, I figured if it's good enough for their kits, it's good enough for me. So what I went with is the Sherwin-Williams P60 G2 Industrial Wash Primer. And that comes, there's a catalyst that you mix that with. So it's a two-part process. You mix those two together and then spray it on. So what I'm doing now is I'm setting up my countersink. I need to countersink the thicker spar doubler to match the dimple holes that I've got in the spar itself. So I'm taking a scrap piece of aluminum here, and I've drilled a few holes in it of the correct size. And then I'm just taking my countersink cutter, setting it up, doing a pass on it, and then testing that against the dimples that are on the spar itself. And I'll just slowly adjust that until I get the correct depth. What I'm basically looking for there is that The part should rotate nicely inside the dimple, but there shouldn't be any movement side to side whatsoever. Once I've got it all set up, then I can go ahead and make the actual countersinks and the spar doubler. All right, so everything's been primed. I just finished putting all of the countersinks in the back of this, the spar doubler, to match the dimples that are in the back of that. So everything's ready to go back together. So next step in the process now is to go ahead and cleco the spar to the spar doubler, put the brackets in there, and then we'll start laying some rivets, put it together. So overall, I feel pretty good about how the primer came out. It's a wash primer, so it's not supposed to be as opaque as normal primers are. I actually think I've got it on there a little bit thicker than what people say. I've looked at a lot of the forums and they say, put it on there light so you just barely see a color change between the aluminum color. It just becomes kind of dull. So I went a little bit thicker than that, partly because I wanted to make sure I had good coverage, but also I just like the color. So I went a little heavier than I probably needed to. I didn't want to go too heavy because they say if you go too heavy, then it's prone to peel a little bit. A little bit of a mess. Not the funnest thing. Fortunately, you don't have to prime every day. So the next time that I have to prime, I'll just wait till I've got everything kind of together, maybe even a couple different parts, get all those together and just make it a one-day priming event. But just clecoed all this stuff back together as far as the spar doubler, the spar, and the hinge brackets for the rudder. And the primer's holding up really well. So, a couple spots where you kind of tap it with the clecos. Doesn't seem like it wants to scratch off at all, so I think it's a good coverage on that. And there's a few different spots the instructions call out where you're gonna leave the hole open, not rivet it, not do anything with it at this stage of the game. So I put tape on one side to make sure I covered up those holes. And then on the other side, I've actually put a cleco in place, put blue tape on there as a reminder not to remove those clecos so that I don't accidentally put a rivet in there. So next step now is to rivet everything together, get flush rivets down here, and then the rest are round head rivets. So I'll get moving on that. So all the riveting on the rear spar is complete. Rudder brackets are all in place and the spar doubler has been riveted down. The only thing left to do now is rivet the rest of the skeleton, and then once that's done, move on to putting the skin on. So here I'm trying to attach the tip rib to the front spar, and it's a really tight angle. It's hard to get the squeezer in there, and I probably should have not used the squeezer, but I went ahead and gave it a shot. And as a result, I'm gonna have to drill out my first rivet on the airplane here. So the first step in that process, I'm using a punch to get a nice little starter hole or a little indentation on the top of the rivet for the drill bit to sit on so that it doesn't wander off. But as you're going to see here with the drill, it's really tough to get the drill nice and perpendicular to the head of it because, again, it's in a really tight spot there. So I'm going to end up with the hole just a little bit off center, and then what I'm going to have to do is get an angle at it and just keep drilling slowly, working myself back toward the center. The idea here is you don't want to enlarge the hole at all. So what I'm doing in the first step is just trying to drill down kind of the depth of the rivet head itself before it gets to the hole with the same size drill bit as the rivet. Once I get to that point, I should be able to get in there with a punch and work the rivet head off. And then I'll take a smaller drill bit and I'll drill down just a little bit into the shank of the rivet. And that's just to reduce the structural integrity of the shank just a little bit, so I can then get a hold of the bottom end with a pair of pliers and just give it a little twist and pull, and it comes right out. Thank God. All right. Got the rivet out without screwing up the hole too bad, I think. So to get the last couple rivets down in here, there's no way that the squeezer would fit up in there. I tried a couple different squeezer yokes on it, and I got one to work, but then it kind of really messed up the rivet, and ended up having to drill that back out. So that was fun. So I used a little extension on the rivet gun. So first foray into using the rivet gun on the actual airplane. It actually went pretty well, so I've got some good rivets there. Had to drill one out. That was the one that I tried to use the squeezer on, and that just didn't work. So lesson learned on that. Don't push it, just go to the rivet gun. But there's the front half, front spar for the vertical stabilizer. Next step is to wrap the whole thing in skin. Start riveting the front of the skin, leaving the back open. And then once we get most of the skin closed, then we'll rivet the rear spar of the vertical stabilizer in place on that. I think I'm going to stop here for today. It's been a long day, but made some good progress on it. Happy that my first rivet I had to drill out was a success. Got the rivet head out, got the tail out. Didn't make the hole any bigger, and then was able to put a rivet back in there and make it all work out nice. So, all right, I'll pick it up tomorrow. So we've got the vertical stabilizer all clecoed together, ready to start riveting. The instructions basically say to start here along the front spar, work your way up, then work your way down, work your way along this rib. That way you can get your hand under there to get all that done. And then from there, go ahead and close up the top and the bottom. Do all that process on both sides, and then reinsert the rear spar that I've got sitting up there along the back and close up the back. So we'll start riveting, see how that goes. There's a few areas where we're going to leave those holes open. That's where there's going to be a fairing that's going to attach this to the rest of the fuselage later on. So we're leaving these holes open. So I've got a cleco in those holes with the tape on it to make sure I don't mess that up. And all of the holes get a -3.5 rivet, with the exception of this one and this one on both sides. They're a -4 because it goes through a little bit of extra material. So put some tape on top of those with the number 4 on it to remind me not to put the wrong rivet in that. So after I set the first rivet, I'm just checking the size of it with a little rivet guide, and it's a little bit tight getting my arms all the way up in there, at least on the top half of this. So I've taken a few of the clecos out of the middle and down at the end just to let that skin have a little bit more flexibility. It's a little bit easier to get my arms up in there. You can reach it okay, but when you're trying to also manipulate the bucking bar behind there, it gets a little bit challenging. So a little bit easier with those rivets out. So I'll work my way basically up and down the forward spar in the vertical stabilizer, and then once that's done, I'll work my way back down the middle of the center rib. So far so good. The rivets are going in pretty well. Also, I'm happy to say that the primer seems like it's holding up really well. I was a little bit concerned about the primer getting scratched up with the bucking bar, that kind of thing, but even though it's I can hear the bucking bar kind of, you know, bucking around in there a little bit every now and then, the primer's holding up really well. So I guess the amount that I've got on there seems to be about the right amount. So that's good. Moving on. For the most part, as long as you can get a good position with the bucking bar on the backside, the riveting's really easy. The rivets that are really challenging are the ones where you just can't really manipulate your fingers around the bucking bar and against the skin just because there's not a lot of room back there. And those are the ones that are a little bit more challenging. But most of them are kind of in open areas where you can really get a good feel for it, and it's not nearly as daunting as it might first seem if you haven't done this kind of thing before. I think for most people, bucking rivets like this is probably the biggest area of concern. It's not something that most of us are used to doing, and it takes a little bit longer than using the squeezer or something like that, just because you need to get in there with your gauge and check each rivet. Once you get kind of in a rhythm with it though, and you've got the gun set up to the right pressure, you have a pretty good feel for how long to buck to squeeze down the rivet, and then you can kind of eyeball it. You get kind of in a rhythm with it, and there's less time spent checking the size of the rivets because you can kind of see it down in there that it's about the same height as all the previous ones. And then periodically you put the gauge on there, just kind of run up and down them all and double check, and you might have to go back and hit one or two a few more times if they're just a little bit out of size, but overall the process starts to speed up fairly well after a little while. So as I mentioned, the instructions tell you to basically work from the front spar out and back along those ribs, then close up your ends. It's not real specific as to whether or not you need to do that on both sides, then close up the sides, or if I can do this, close up this side, and then do the other side. So I'm going to close up these ends because right now the other ends are closed up with Clecos and they didn't impede my progress doing anything on this side, so I think I'm safe to do that. We're going to find out. So for most of these rivets that I'm closing up on the end with a pneumatic squeezer, I'm using a standard 3-inch yoke with a mushroom head rivet set on one side and then the flat set on the back side to squeeze the bottom of the rivet. But when I get up here near the top, there's just not room for the squeezer yoke and that rivet set to fit up in there. So I'm switching out here to a narrow nose yoke, which doesn't have a rivet set on it. It's just a flat piece of steel that's very narrow. It works kind of like a bucking bar on the back side. So you've just got the mushroom set on the outside, and as you see here, I'm just going to move that piston up nice and slow, get it real close until I know I'm perfectly perpendicular and centered up on the rivet head, and then I'll make the final squeeze. And it works out great. And now I'm just flipping it over to do the same process on the back side. Alright, so the vertical stabilizer is all together except for the rear spar, so the last step in the process is to go ahead and Cleco this in place, and then we will rivet this top rib to here. We'll rivet the root rib down here, seal up the skin with rivets, and then the last part is this middle rib gets attached with pop rivets in the back because there's no other way to do it. So here I'm just removing that tape that I put over those holes because I don't want to seal up the tape onto the inside of that. Almost forgot to do that, so make a note to make sure if you've got any tape on some parts that are about to go on the inside, take that off first. And finally, the last step in the process is just riveting that center rib to the rear spar using the pop type rivets that are called out for in the instructions. So the important part here is to just make sure that you keep the rivet gun nice and tight against the head as you're squeezing that, to make sure you get a nice flush fit with that rivet. And that is it. One vertical stabilizer, now complete. All right, well that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. Overall, everything looked pretty decent. Not a whole lot of issues with the rivet bucking or anything like that. A little bit tight spots. Some are tougher to reach into than others. But overall, I mean, I'm pretty happy with the way things came out. The primer, I like the color of the primer. Like I said, I think I'm probably just a tiny bit heavier on the coat than you're supposed to with this stuff. This goes on extremely light from everything that I've heard, but I went just a little bit heavier than that. Not too heavy that it gunked up anything. Everything still fit together good. Just gave it a little bit more of a color. The skin itself looks good. So that's a wrap on the vertical stabilizer. Next up, I think, is the rudder. We'll work on that. That'll attach back here on these brackets. As always, I hope you guys enjoying the content. If you are, please give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends about it. If you've got some friends that might be interested in watching me try to put this thing together. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video.